Okay, Algebra 1, 9.4. We are going to complete the square to solve equations. Now, this process can solve any quadratic. You guys graphed. When you graphed, it wasn't very accurate. Things were off sometimes they were good. But this, completing the square, will always give us the right answer if you do it correctly. So, what are the steps? I got 6 steps here to solve, and this is the process for completing the square. We're going to go over these steps, and then we'll do 2 examples to make sure that we understand it. Number 1 is separate the variables from all else. So that means bring the x's, most of the time they're x's, bring those to one side, bring the constant to the other side. These are going to be set equal to 0, the quadratics. So therefore, x is on one side, everything else on the other. Number 2, you're going to make sure a equals 1, because if a equals 1, your life's a little bit easier. If it's not, there's a little bit of work to do. So then what we're going to do is, if it's not, you're going to divide by a. So divide by a if it's not. That'll make it, because a divided by a is 1. Guarantees it. Step number 3 is the actual part where I am going to complete the square, and that is adding 1/2 of b, the middle term, half of that, squared to both sides. Now, as we're going to get into our problem, you're going to see that the side with the variables, I'm going to leave it inside of a parentheses squared. But on the other side, I will square it, put it down as a number. So one side will say 3 squared, and the other side will say 9. We'll get there. So I leave it that way because I have to factor. Basically, when you're completing the square, you're trying to create a perfect square binomial, which then can become to an x plus 2 squared or an x minus 2 squared, which is really nice. And then you simplify the right-hand side, the side with just the numbers, and then you go about solving it for x. To solve it, you take the square root of both sides, but remember when you're solving for a variable and have to take a square root, you have to have a plus and a minus there. And then from there, you can solve for your variable. Our first problem is x squared minus 6x plus 12 equals 19. So we want to solve this. So our first step said, separate the variables from everything else. To do that, I am going to get 12 to the other side, or subtract 12 from both sides. So I get x squared minus 6x equals 7. Now, wait a minute. Why did I just put plus something plus something? It's because I already looked ahead and said a is equal to 1. And if a is equal to 1, I can jump over the fact that I would have to divide anything. I'm ready to add. And so a is equal to 1, so I'm going to add something to both sides. So I put the spaces in there to signify that, yep, I'm ready to add. Is everybody up to this point gets this, that I just separated them and set it up so I know I have to add? What am I going to add? You're going to add 1/2 of b squared. b is this number. What is that number? It's negative 6. What's half of negative 6? Negative 3. So I'm going to change colors so we can see it a little better. But it would be a negative 3 squared. And this is where I said I'm going to leave one of them with parentheses squared. But then what is negative 3 squared? Negative 3 times negative 3? It's a positive 9. And so on the right-hand side, I will add 9. The next step said simplify the right side, factor the left. So when I go to factor the left, this side right here, guys, is a perfect square trinomial. And so, without having to do all the rigmarole of actually trying to see if it's a perfect square trinomial, it is, because we created it, it's going to become x minus 3. Wait a minute. Is there a connection between that minus 3 and that minus 3? Yeah, it's going to always be the same. Equals, what's 7 plus 9? 16. Now we can technically solve. But to solve, I need to get that square out of there, so we take the square root of both sides. Now, a square and a square root cancel each other. This is where I have in our steps that you can't forget plus or minus. Plus or minus because I'm solving for a variable. So I sneak that plus or minus up in here. These will cancel each other out. I'm left with x minus 3 equals plus or minus, what's the square root of 16? 4. And now I can solve for my variable. I got to get x by itself, so what do I need to do? Get rid of the negative 3 by adding 3. Here's the issue that students make. They add it wrong. Or subtract it. It matters what it is. Whatever you're bringing across from here to this side cannot be directly combined. I'm not going to put the 3 and the 4 together. Yet. What needs to happen is you need to take whatever you're bringing across first and then put plus or minus the remaining problem. Why is this? It's because there's always 2 answers. Well, not always, but 99% of the time there's going to be 2 answers. One of those answers is 3 plus 4, and the other one is 3 minus 4. So yes, if you would have added the 3 and 4 together, you would have got one of the answers, but you would have not have gotten both answers. And what's 3 plus 4? 7, and 3 minus 4 is negative 1. And those are your answers to the quadratic. You could have graphed it. You could have found the same thing. Probably would have been really close. But that is completing the square. Second problem is negative 2x squared plus 8x minus 18. So, step number 1 said, separate. So, what do I get to the other side? I'm going to get the 18 to the other side. So I'm going to add 18 to both sides. Negative 2x squared plus 8x equals 18. Notice that this time I did not put plus something. I did not do that here because A is not 1. I want this. I need this to be a 1. So to make this a 1, I divide it by negative 2. So now I need to go back and divide both sides by negative 2. Now remember how to divide something with a common denominator. That means I can just divide these two and then go back and divide those two. What's negative 2 divided by negative 2? It's 1. What's 8 divided by negative 2? So it's negative 4x plus something equals, what is 18 divided by negative 2? It becomes negative 9 plus something. And that something is half of b squared. What is b? p is the negative 4, right? What's half of negative 4? Negative 2 squared, and negative 2 squared is 4. What is the left-hand side going to factor to? X. What? Minus 2 equals negative 5. So the question then is we go to do this. We go to square root, and you get x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 5. Wait a minute, can you take a square root of a negative number right now? No. We can, but it's not going to be a real number. So, for these types of problems, you just have to say no real solution, and you're done. If there was a real solution, that would have been the square root of 5. That would have been okay. Square root of 10, square root of 25, all okay. But this one was the square root of a negative number. You're done. You have to stop. Same process every single time, over and over.